Okay. But the topic is really where the faculties of mentality come to be experienced, and how this relates to the aspects of contact, feeling, perception, attention, but also how this is linking to vitality and heat. So the starting point that one may have is there's a body and there's a mind, and there's two separate things. And now, based on the Buddha's teaching, we've actually seen that things are interconnected. And consciousness and mentality, materiality are basically two interdependent activities. So with that, the question may be, how is contact to be experienced from a body and mental perspective, and how do the five aggregates fit into this?
Yeah. So if you look at mentality and materiality and that interdependence between mentality, materiality, and consciousness, let's go back to the suttas where Sariputta is talking about how when he's talking about dependent origination, there is a consciousness that is established in mentality and materiality, and it bends towards some kind of a contact. This bending towards, it's an interesting way of talking about it, because one of the synonyms for nama, which is the Pali for mentality, is to lean towards. So once the consciousness is established in the mentality and materiality, that consciousness is leaning towards some kind of contact, leaning towards some kind of sensory experience. But if that consciousness was not leaning towards something and not established, then that is that special state that the Buddha talks about in reference to the consciousness that knows no bounds, meaning it is not limited, by the faculties. That's not to say that it is some special state of consciousness. It's just that that consciousness doesn't go outward towards any kind of sensory experience. Now, when we look at the different factors of mentality, we have five. We have the five faculties, which are contact, feeling, perception, intention, and attention. And this is another way of understanding the five aggregates. So the five aggregates here we understand to be form, feeling, perception, formations, and consciousness. Now, these wonderfully are interspersed within the factors of mentality and materiality itself. Materiality in this case is form. It's any kind of form, but in specificity, it's in regards to the actual physical body, which is made up of the traditional understanding of the four great elements. This is earth, water, air, and fire. So earth here is in reference to, if we look at it from a newer perspective, a more modern perspective, we understand earth to be all of those solid molecules that make up the different parts of the body and the cells and so on and so forth. Then water referring to the liquid nature, the cohesion that happens between each molecule and the ability of that molecule to be less static. There is still some movement going on in terms of this liquidity. Then you have air, which is the gaseous molecules, the digestive air and the air that we take in through the lungs and so on and so forth. And the way we speak, we're actually using air, we're forcing out air, and then the tongue and different parts of the mouth and throat create sounds, but it's the air itself through which communication arises, the usage of that air. We have fire, which is plasma molecules, or the state of matter known as plasma. And this plasma on a macro level refers to the heat of the sun or the fire that one burns and so on. But it can be equated to or equivalent to the neural firing that happens in the brain itself. and throughout the entire nervous system. Now, coming to the brain itself and the nervous system, you can think of the brain and the nervous system, while it is a physical component of the body, the activity that arises and passes away through the brain and the spine and the nervous system, that activity is really the processes of contact, feeling, perception, intention, and attention, which means that the potentials for contact to arise happen through this nervous system. The potentials for feeling to arise happens through this nervous system. The feeling to perceive, the feeling to have an intention, or the experience to have an intention, the experience or sensation of attention happens all through the brain and the nervous system. So when we look at how contact arises, it arises when there is some kind of, now we'll use the eye just as an example, or seeing as an example. That contact is the initial stimulation of the retina. Now you have light bouncing off of, now in front of me there's a tree, so I'll use that example. You have a light bouncing off of the tree that hits the eye. That impact, that sensory impact, is contact. It's the conjoining of that light bouncing off the tree, and then it's the consciousness, the eye consciousness, and then the eye itself, the retina, the receptor within the eye. When that arises, those three come together, there is contact. That's the initial stimulation. This then feeds information into the mind. Now, in this case, we can equate the mind and the brain as one and the same, because the mind is made up of different processes, the same way the brain is made up or creates different processes dependent upon information and dependent upon different causes and conditions. So to simplify, you really have these different kinds of experiences. And so the broad sense, I mean, the brain is quite complex and the nervous system is quite complex. But if you were to create broad categories of experience and broad categories of interaction with the outside world, so to speak, it happens through the sensory information. It happens through the six sense bases. So now the light hits the eye. We have the retina receiving that, the photoreceptors receiving that. That is contact. Now my experience of seeing is registered in the mind, and that is the experience of feeling. That happens because of certain components in the brain, which can be equated to the faculty of feeling in mentality. And then my ability to see that or know that what I am seeing is a tree is the experience of perception. So I see it as a neutral, I could see it as a neutral sensation, as a neutral feeling, or I could see it as a pleasant or unpleasant, dependent upon memory and past learning. So perception is always dependent upon what we learn from the past. It arises based and dependent upon the feeling, but the perception itself is being informed by past knowledge, this memory bank that's there in the brain, let's say. So that is equivalent to the faculty of perception in mentality. So it's a different component. Then we have the intention. This intention arises based on if I'm seeing something and I want to do something, like I want to walk to that tree and get the shade of the tree. This is the intention. This intention arises dependent upon contact. And so now what we're looking at, there are three components to look at, which are all equivalent. So on the physical level, are on the level of the brain and neuroscience, we have components in the brain that are equivalent to the faculties of contact, feeling, and perception within mentality, which is mentality, materiality. And so within mentality, materiality, that is included in that is the six sense basis. So while there is the delineation between mentality and materiality, it also includes the six sense. It's through that then we have contact, feeling, and perception. And it's a mentality that is able to translate what is happening in real time. So it's equivalent to what is happening in terms of processes in the brain, contact, feeling, perception. This also is equivalent to the aggregates of form, because you have the form of the actual mentality materiality making contact with the outside world, with feeling, which is the actual sensation of seeing, and perception, which is the actual knowing that what I'm seeing is a tree, for example. So far we have this. Now with intention, intention is equivalent to formations. It is through intention, the process of intention, that formations are arising and are activated, and then giving rise to a conscious experience, consciousness that experiences certain things, or the consciousness of knowing certain things that are being experienced, to put it a different way. So these formations we know to be three kinds of formations. The way I explain formations is they are pockets of experience. They're potentials for experience. So they are sort of like the very fundamental building blocks of having some kind of an experience. They are like the ones and zeros that make up the code of a software. So these different types of formations, there are three in particular. There is the mental formations that allow in the brain. So now we're going back to the neuroscience perspective, allow the synapses to fire. So the firing of the synapses in the mental formations are providing the ability for the brain to process information in the form of feeling and perception. The physical formation has to do, particularly in the suttas, with breathing. And this breathing can be conscious or unconscious. Most of the time, it's unconscious breathing, so to speak, meaning we don't really control the breath. It arises based on the body and the brain informing the body how much oxygen is there, and so on and so forth. But this also ties into other parts of the bodily processes, like the metabolism, vitality, temperature, and all kinds of other things related to those formations, physical formations. Then the verbal formations are essentially the thinking process that arises when we are met with some kind of information, or we are in a conversation and we want to express something. So intention is most dominant, you could say, through the process of speech or through some kind of action or expression. And so verbal formations are those synapses in the brain that then give to the brain, that give to the rest of the body some kind of expression to do. So it provides information, it has neural firing that happens that then gives rise to the intention to walk towards that tree. Or it accesses certain other parts of the memory to think about that tree and then say, how beautiful is that tree? Express verbally that that tree is wonderful. When I was so and so at this time, I remember seeing a tree like it before when I was here, or whatever it might be. So intention is driven forward by the faculty and process of intention in mentality, as a factor of mentality in mentality materiality. That's within the scope of mentality materiality. But it is equivalent to the formations for the of expressing those formations in some way, especially verbal formations and the process of thinking. So this is equivalent to the synapses that fire in the mind or in the brain to be able to make some kind of action, to be able to make some kind of decision, or to make some kind of speech. So this neural pathway that is there present through the nervous system is the actual form, but the firing of that is equivalent to the different mechanics of mentality materiality. Then we have attention. So in the process of seeing something, now my attention is there, let's say, so to speak. Because my attention is there is a flow of sensory consciousness, that conjoining of the light of the eye and the eye consciousness happens because of attention. And so this attention is dependent upon intention to see something and to pay attention to something. So their attention and intention can be interconnected based on that. Now, the equivalent on the neuroscientific scientific perspective is this. In the brain, there are parts which pay attention. There are parts which are paid attention because of the intention to pay attention. In the 5 aggregates, it refers to consciousness, which is in reference to being aware of something. Consciousness here being aware or having attention towards something.
And then if the Buddha is describing, in the seeing, there's only the seeing. And relate that back to intention and the flow of seeing this tree where there's contact, there's visual consciousness. So in that situation, does it mean that the contact does not generate any new consciousness, but it's just a passing away of that consciousness, and there's the visual perception of that tree, there's no craving, and there's no new formations which will arise based on that contact?
Yeah, so that's a good bringing up of the sutta, because when the Buddha talks about in the seeing, there's only the seeing, in the hearing, there is only the hearing, he's referring to the process of actual feeling. Now, we talked about sankharas in the way of those basic formations. There are another kind of sankharas, so to speak. There is different ways to understand formations through understanding the 3 basic formations or categories of processes that happen in the mind and the body and so on. But there's also what they call Ayu Sankhara, which is in relation to longevity and vitality. And here specifically, there's something known as Abhisankharas. And these are sometimes translated as volitional formations. Volitional here in reference to kama, in reference to doing something, or karmic formations. Abhisankharas are essentially, I translate as fettered formations, which means, let's say, going back to the equivalency of neuroscience, you have the synapses in the brain that are firing. But there are certain synapses that fire in conjunction because of a certain way that the person, so to speak, behaves and reacts to situations. So if someone continues to take something personal, and so in the seeing, somebody takes that seeing as personal and then causes craving to arise or aversion to arise because of the conjunction of different synapses that fire. But the moment somebody starts to look at it as just the seeing and let go of the craving, it exercises in the mind a different set of synapses that become more strengthened. So these synapses are purified formations, so to speak. They replace those fettered formations, which are those synapses that are conducive to creating craving, conducive to creating personalizing. So when the Buddha says in the seeing, there is only the seeing, even if there is an intention of seeing, it happens very quick. It happens in microseconds. But in that process of seeing, there's no more of this projecting or sticking into that feeling the idea of an I or an association based on past memories of an I or an association of an I doing something, which can cause personalizing, which can cause identifying, and which can cause the craving to arise.
And looking at the conjunction between brain and mind, and looking at them as like one angle, one coin with two sides of it, would it be a fair statement to state that if one is in training, one is actually training the formations in terms of being wholesome formations, but also it means that the potentials which are available are basically the potentials from, let's call it, old times, meaning lifetimes, realms, whatever it may be, and the choices that one makes in any given moment based on context, or old and new karma comes together, is basically also changing the brain structure and the synapses that are available on a physical level.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. So when a being is born into this world out of the womb, they actually have more synapses than an adult would have, because there's so much information that the brain is taking in those first few formative years. But it's also because of, let's say, lifetimes of different experiences. Now, what happens is once they start to experience certain things, certain synapses are strengthened. But because of inactivity of other synapses, and because the world, so to speak, is starting to be conceptualized in a certain way, those formations or those synapses are pruned away. They are, because of inactivity, they just drop away. They no longer continue to behave in the same way because of that inactivity. So in the same way, now, when we have certain choices now as an adult, or as an adolescent or whatever it might be, but once you start training in the Dhamma, you start to see in the choices that you make that there's certain projections of seeing the world in a way, in a certain way. And so because of that, you personalize things dependent upon past experiences. Let's say you're meeting your friend after a long time, for example, and you meet them and you have certain ideas about them based on the last time you met them, or based on when maybe you were a friend of them in high school. But then when you actually see them, the information is different. And so there's this cognitive dissonance because they're no longer the same person you thought them to be based on your memories. And so the mind makes that connection and sees that and drops away. Maybe it might take some time, but it drops away any of those images about that person based on their new information. Now, internalizing that in terms of choices, in terms of how one makes choices, when somebody makes a wholesome choice, practicing intentionally a wholesome choice, they start to, let's say, activate or strengthen, let's say, if there are already pre-existing formations or pre-existing synapses for making the wholesome choices, those are strengthened, or at least at the very least strengthened or awakened, while because you didn't make the choice that led you to act in an unwholesome manner, those formations or those synapses, because of inactivity, don't fire, they don't activate. And through not being activated, they start to get pruned away. It happens slowly but surely, and with effort and practice. Eventually, this remainderless fading away is really the remainderless fading away of the fetters in those formations. Or in other words, on a neuroscientific level, the pruning away of those formations or those synapses that are no longer being used and are now just instead bypassed, used for different purposes. That's the beautiful thing about what people are discovering now. But what the Buddha was able to see is that karma, because of karma and because of choices in every moment, the mind actually does make physical changes, let's say the brain. And this is referring to neuroplasticity. The current understanding is that indeed the brain does make physical changes dependent upon behavior and external environment and circumstances. So in that sense, we are in control of, for lack of a better word, of making those choices in a way that restructures the actual physical brain to be able to see the world in certain ways through compassion and equanimity and loving kindness. And because of that, it starts to edge away, it starts to erode those synapses because of their inactivity, and they fade away. And so even different parts of the brain that start to create the sense of self, because now that is a very deep intrinsic part of the brain, which has this survival instinct that I need to protect myself, and that from there, craving arises and personalizing arises and all of that. But because one is able to make the practice in such a way through behavioral changes and through changes in the meditation itself, because what you have to understand is in the meditation as well, karma is being experienced in the way of hindrances or other factors that are arising. How one reacts to it will determine whether that karma continues based on continuing to feed it attention, or by letting it go, allow that karma to just dissipate. So that karma is tied to certain synapses, which then create certain experiences, even in meditation. But because of the daily practice of behavioral changes, of seeing the unwholesome and then letting go of that and replacing it with the wholesome, and because that is informing the meditation practice, that starts to silence parts of the mind that start to personalize. And eventually they become completely docile, completely dormant, and finally inactive in the level of the arhat, so that nothing is equated or nothing is experienced through some personal sense of self. And because of that, no kind of craving arises, no kind of conflict arises, no kind of personalizing arises.
And in daily life, it is often mentioned that stress, anxiety, and these type of emotions are experienced in the body, meaning the body has a higher temperature. There's like different feelings that are rising in the body, which can be triggered by mind and brain states, can be hormones, can be anything else. And this then is triggered by the craving to a feeling that is arising based on previous karma. Is that correct?
Yes, there is this, again, there is this interconnection with mind and body, so to speak. So, which means that if you do have craving, or if one does have aversion or starts to personalize, there is actually a sense of tightness that arises in the body and in the mind. Or if the mind is, or if the body is very energetic, or there's a lot of activity going on, it can translate in the brain as anxiety, or just a lot of firing of different formations or neurons and things like that. And if somebody personalizes it, that causes restlessness and anxiety. And so one can actually see that if the mind is too active, it can cause too much activity in the body, and vice versa. If the body is too active, it can cause a lot of activity in the mind. Now, on the flip side of that, in terms of a mind that is having sloth and torpor, that can arise because the body is tired, for example. So, what one needs to understand is be mindful of the body to the extent of seeing if craving is arising because of certain things that are happening in the body. This actually allows one to see that all of this is an interconnected, but ultimately impersonal process. When there is a personalizing of seeing the body as being energetic and then causing that or equating that to anxiety, that is because I am feeling that anxiety now. Whereas if you just see it as a process where the body is very active, and so you know that if the body is very active, you take a rest and just relax it and tranquilize, with meditation and so on. So that process of seeing the tension that arises in the head, or the tension that arises in the body, or maybe blood pressure, and arising in blood pressure, and arising in heart rate, and arising in temperature, or whatever it might be. These are all manifestations, or can be manifestations, of craving arising or aversion arising. Because when the body perceives something as, let's say, on a very primitive level, food, that fight or flight action that happens in the brain is a result of taking something personal. And so that creates stress. And then that stress manifests as tension and the other different parts or processes that happen. But as soon as one personalizes that, then there is further craving or further aversion that arises. But if one can become mindful that this is just an impersonal process, and then take the initiative to just relax that fight or flight mode of thinking, and therefore de-stress the body through that relaxation process, through right effort of seeing that there is an unwholesome state arising, letting go of your attention to it. Because remember, the attention is what feeds or nutrifies whatever is arising. As soon as you take attention away from that, bring it back to the present and the presence of awareness of the mind and body and relax it, you are in control, let's say, of that stress now. Because now you have seen it to be impersonal and you let go of it. And then you replace it with something that is wholesome, like a smile or loving kindness or whatever it might be. So once you start to notice this as an impersonal process, then you become more aware of when there's certain things happening, but you no longer identify with it. So if you feel like the heart rate is fast, somebody might take that to be meaning anxiety, or there's something wrong going on here, and then starts to personalize and then create more aversion and other pain and suffering. Whereas if you just notice it to be, okay, the heart is beeping, pumping really fast, and the heart rate is pretty fast, just come back to the mind and body and relax and let go and see if the mind is thinking about something or personalizing something or getting stressed about something. But as soon as you take your attention away from it, it doesn't mean to ignore it. You've actually acknowledged it by seeing it. As soon as you take your attention away from it after that, then the mind will start to relax in itself, because no longer is the attention feeding that anxiety, no longer is it feeding that unwholesome, uncomfortable feeling, but then coming back to relaxing, coming back to letting go of that tension. So whenever you see tension, it as a manifestation of stress or a manifestation of craving, if you personalize it. But if you see that tension and you just let it go, you're still letting go of the potential for craving to further arise. So in an unreleased mind also, for example, because of certain health conditions, that body might have, heart problems, or um, it might have a overactive, thyroid or some kind of hormonal imbalance. But just because that's the case, an unreleased mind won't identify with it and say, I am feeling this and this is what's happening in the very intrinsic level. They might communicate saying, I'm feeling unwell, or I'm feeling uncomfortable, or whatever it might be, but they don't take it to be personal to the extent that it causes internal anxiety. They just see it as for what it is and then do the necessary steps, which means that not only does it need to be just to relax the body, if the body needs to be relaxed, but also taking certain medications or other different kinds of means of making sure that the body comes back into homeostasis. But on a very general level, when you equate craving with tension, that's a good way of understanding it. So always come back to the mind and see, is there any pain here? Is there any tension? Usually some people will experience tension in the shoulders or in the neck because they're focusing too hard on something, or they've just been, very stressed about something. And as soon as they let go and relax, they start to notice the muscles loosen, and that lets go of any further craving or aversion from arising.
And then in terms of the relationship between body and mind, and the reference in the suttas to vitality and heat, where the Buddha is talking about the differences between one in cessation of perception and feeling, and one where all the faculties have dissipated. So then how do we look into the interrelationship between vitality and heat?
Yeah. So the heat of the body is essentially one's, well, when I say one's, the body's metabolism. So cellular metabolism. The body is still active, so to speak, in sensation of perception and feeling. Whereas in one that is dead, meaning it's just a corpse, there will actually still be some kind of cellular activity for a certain period of time, and then there is decay, but there's no longer any metabolism to maintain heat in the body. That's why a corpse is old and lifeless. It doesn't no longer have that temperature. And so the heat is caused by certain mechanisms within the body related to circulation, blood circulation, related to metabolism or metabolizing of sugars. You know, the cells start to metabolize certain sugars for it to continue to be alive, so to speak. This vitality has to do with electrical activity more than anything else. Vitality is what is not the actual synapses in the brain, but allows for information through electrical impulses. So in a corpse, when somebody passes away, there's still some activity going on in the brain. So they're not completely dead yet, so to speak. And this is happening because they're seeing certain formations, and then that can give rise to a further rebirth if they attach to it and so on. That's in reference to rebirth. But once one is completely dead, meaning there is no more vitality in the body, it means there is no more electrical impulse going on in the way of the nervous system. And so this vitality has to do with the actual firing of one electrical impulse to the next to relay information in the cells, to relay information to the different organs of the body, and to relay information about whether the hormones are in balance or not, and all the other different mechanisms of the body. Once that is gone, then the body is starting to go into a mode of inactivity, ultimately dying. You know, the organs shut down, the cells decay, there's nothing else going on, and then complete death, complete its extinguishment, so to speak. Really the difference. A corpse will not have that kind of electrical activity going on in the neural pathways. And that, so there won't be any vitality. And finally, there won't be any metabolizing going on. So there won't be any heat that is processed. That heat is a result of metabolism, you could say. So the heat that you feel on the body is because of the circulation that's going on, but also because of the cells eating up food and so on. That's why you will notice, for example, this is a very mundane example, but you will notice that when you eat food and you check your temperature, it's slightly elevated. And that's because of the digestive processes and metabolizing of the sugars and different nutrients from the body. But if somebody has been hungry or hasn't eaten for some time and you check their temperature, it's slightly less than, let's say, what is considered normal. And that's because there's not a lot of metabolic activity happening through digestion and so on. But ultimately, there is this heat which sustains the body. If there was not that heat or vitality, then that body would be a corpse.
No more questions, Delson.